as a practitioner and an educator, then I'm thinking that what's the message? What's the message I want to impart? And it really is about the sense of agency and the sense of self-awareness and the sense of knowing what you need to know. And here's the way to do it. Because every time I learn something new, I'm always thinking, how can I use this? How can I integrate this? So if I learn some theory or research, whatever, or I see something, I hear something, how can I integrate this?
Hello and welcome. As always, I'm Abbie. This is Stories Lived, Stories Told, and today I invite you to join me as we revisit a previously recorded conversation with Beth Fisher-Yoshida, in which we take a communication perspective on women, power, and negotiation. To take a communication perspective is to consider what we're making and how we're making it through our communication practices. This means we look closely at patterns, contexts, stories, and relationships, and that we use curiosity, mindfulness, collaboration, and dialogue to create better social worlds. Whether the topic of today's conversation is familiar to you or not, the hope is that using a communication perspective will reveal new ways of seeing and being. At the top of the episode, you heard our conversation partner, Beth Fisher-Yoshida. Among many things, all of which you can learn about in the show notes of this episode, Beth is a steward for the CMM Institute, as well as the author of New Story, New Power, A Woman's Guide to Negotiation. As we revisit this conversation, which was originally published in 2 parts in October 2023, I invite you to pay attention to how this conversation hits you differently now and what new wisdom you hear that you might have missed before. I've chosen to share this conversation again in hopes that it can provide some context, as it is the first episode of our new series for this month about taking a communication perspective on the experiences of women. In this series, I hope that we can explore together the ways in which stories and meaning that have been socially constructed shape the lives of women and of everybody, really. This series is originally being released during the month of March, which is Women's History Month in the United States, but really these are conversations for any and every time. Okay, so with that, let's begin our conversation with Beth. Hi, Beth. Thanks for being here today. I'm so looking forward to our conversation and getting to talk to you.
Hi, Abbie. I really am looking forward to it as well. So thank you for the invitation.
Absolutely. Before we dive into the real content of our conversation, I'm wondering if you would share some stories about yourself to introduce yourself a little bit. Maybe knowing some of the topic of the conversation we're going to have today, you could share some stories that feel like good context for that you want people to know about you going into this conversation.
Okay, sure. So most of my time is spent being a professor of practice at Columbia University in the city of New York. I also direct the master's program in negotiation and conflict resolution. And then I always say, if you stick around long enough, you have other positions that sort of pop up. So I'm also the executive director of a consortium that we have, which is the Advanced Consortium for Cooperation, Conflict, and Complexity, which does a lot of work with the CMM Institute. And then within which is AC4 for short, for the acronym, within AC4, I also direct the Youth, Peace, and Security, which now is Youth, Peace, and Society program. I have to remember to change that title in my head. And separate from what I'm doing at the university, I also do consulting and coaching. So over the years, my consulting practice has focused more on going into organizational contexts and doing some kind of assessment intervention around conflict. Sometimes it's, something mild, just like, well, let's just sort of come to an agreement on what a vision and mission is. And sometimes it's much more trying to intervene in a very toxic situation because the conflict has gone on for what I would say is too long, maybe 5 years that people have been working through those conditions. And then separately from all that, I also do writing, as you know. And so my interest in research and writing, and I should say research really with an applied research. I'm more of a scholar practitioner. So I started more as a practitioner and transitioned into somewhere in the middle. So my research recently has focused a lot on women and negotiation. And my book that came out earlier this year is New Story, New Power, A Woman's Guide to Negotiation. And I've just recently decided that I'm going to do another book on women and negotiation, and I'm still trying to figure out exactly the framing of it, but it will be something related to more in-depth case studies that I just can't decide yet if it's going to be real women with real names or real women with fictitious names. So that's
Sure.
what I'm kind of thinking about it.
Yeah, that's great.
Let me just make one more connection. So then
Please.
The CMM part, I studied at Fielding Graduate University in the 1990s. Seems like an incredibly long time ago. And I met Barnett Pierce there at that time. And that's when I was introduced to CMM. And since then, CMM just permeates every part of my life, all the work that I do, research, practice, teaching, everything. It's just in there all the time. So it's not even that I have to consciously say, okay, what am I going to do CMM-ish? It's that I'm doing it and just thinking, well, how am I going to frame it and which angle and all of that. So that's enough about me for now.
Yeah, no, that is a great start. One follow-up question I'm just curious for the people that I get to talk to, that are in the world of communication is what makes you passionate about what you do in the world of communication and conflict and the consulting you do?
Yeah, good question. So I think part of it is when people get that aha kind of moment, and it doesn't have to be earth-shattering aha. It just needs to be a shift, as minor or major as it is, just a shift in perspective, which happens through CMM, where something that was not explicit becomes explicit and sheds a new light on something that they didn't realize before. So people are able to now reframe how they look at something. They're able to get new insights. And because of that, then they get more choice, more flexibility in what they're choosing to do to go forward. So there's that sense of agency as well, which I believe we all have to some degree. Of course, there are constraints of how much you can exert your agency rather, in any particular context. But that's what excites me, is when people get new perspectives.
Yeah, I think that's very similar for me too. The idea of meaning making and that we get to choose the meaning is what really kind of got me hooked in the world of CMM, because that was kind of a novel idea to me. Growing up, I didn't have that kind of perspective. It was kind of like, here's the objective, here's what's right and wrong, what's good and bad. And there wasn't a lot of conversation about how those meanings were made. And so to explore that has been really meaningful for me.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Beth, to use the CMM-ish language, what is your idea of what a better social world looks like?
Well, a couple of different things. I was just yesterday actually thinking about a little talk I'm going to give at somebody's dinner. And when I go to Colombia later this week, I'm going to be at a dinner. We're sponsoring a dinner for somebody who just completed his university. And in Colombia, it's a 5-year program. So there are 10 semesters. So he just completed it against all odds, because he was a student who probably would never have reached that university. And long story short, we were able to work out something where he was able to do it. And he had the fortitude and the commitment to do that. And he persevered, and he's a brilliant artist, and he became even more brilliant because he learned so many different techniques. So we're having this dinner, this celebration dinner, and I said, you know what, I'm going to give a little talk, a little speech in Spanish, which is not my strength by any means. But so I'm having a friend of mine check it now, but I was thinking about what I was going to say, and they all know CMM. And so what I was going to say, one part of it, is really that when we succeed in anything we do, all of us succeed, right? And so it's a matter of shifting the vibrations in the world, just shifting something. So somebody called Rupert Sheldrake, who talks about the morphinogenic field, and not to get too technical about things, but in essence, it's where we all learn from like a collective memory. So if something happens, and I was giving the example in my speech too, before anybody knew how to ride a bicycle, it was incredibly difficult to ride a bike. Nobody knew how to ride it, right?
Yeah, right.
One person started to ride it, and then more people started to ride it. There was something about the vibrations in the universe where other people were able to do it more easily. So what I want to impart on these youth leaders that I work with is that there's no need for jealousies or for envy, which sometimes does happen, that there's a reason to celebrate, because when one person succeeds in anything they're doing, it already sets the plate for other people to succeed as well. It's just one step closer.
Yeah.
And so that I want people to celebrate with each other in that. So that's what a better social world will be, where not only do we support and love each other and make that space possible, but that we celebrate each other and that we feel the joy in somebody else's success also being good for us, not that we should be envious of that. So that's kind of what we're working towards.
Yeah. Yeah. That I know that gender is a big lens that you use and talk about and think about and research and write about. And it's a compelling one for me too. And that makes me think about that. That is maybe especially true for like women's relationships to each other, that there's a lot of like comparison and competition, that kind of, if you're living in a patriarchal society, that's maybe one of the tools of keeping women oppressed, or, whatever language you would use there to say that when women are in competition with each other, when we're not celebrating each other's advances and seeing other women's success as our own success, or seeing, kind of like a scarcity mindset of, oh, the resources are limited, so if you're doing well, that's taking away from me doing well, that kind of keeps you stunted and not able to grow as a group or a community.
Yeah, if we think about the token spot that's open, so, okay, we have a woman here, check that off the list, then that is the scarcity mindset you mentioned. On LinkedIn, I was really happy to see that there's a hashtag like women helping women, or women supporting women, or women for women. I forgot exactly all the terminology, but I always like that, because that's what happens, is that we make it possible for all of us to be there. Then that means when we do, we creating like a critical mass, which shifts, like Malcolm Gladwell says, the tipping point of what shifts things, so that it's no longer the token woman or the token underrepresented group in any kind of diversity initiative, but it really is that's the norm. And so even that we don't have to pay attention to it is where we're headed. That's a good social world too, that we don't have to see what's the composition of this group or this team or this organization. We just take it for granted because it is diverse naturally, without having to pay attention to it in that special way. Because then it does seem like tokenism. And then at school, we're always talking about admissions and hiring and what's happening with affirmative action, what's happening in DEA, and how do you create the space not only to bring people in, but to mentor them and nurture them so that they succeed. Because that's something that I think in general, we're not as good at. We're better collectively at bringing people in the recruiting process, but we're not as good at keeping them and maintaining them and helping them grow. And so later this month, I'm doing a talk for women in cable television. So it's communication, media, entertainment. And I was doing a little bit of research and preparing for that. And especially past or post-pandemic, there's a whole new phenomenon happening in the workplace. So in general, people are leaving their workplace more than they did before. People are more selective in what they want. They're particular in what they want. But when it comes to women, more women leaders are leaving than men. And so the other thing people are asking for is more flexibility in the workplace. They want to be able to work remote, because we learned through the pandemic we can work remotely. There's some things that are nicer in person, but we can also do remote, and having that flexibility. So for me, I say, okay, let's turn that disaster into an opportunity, because organizations are struggling. When you look at the pipeline, the people coming up in the pipeline have been reduced in terms of diversity. So it's an opportunity for negotiation and for having more agency and more strength from your negotiation position. And I think not to be arrogant or nasty or stubborn about it, but just to say, this is a source of strength for me, because I know I'm needed and I know what I have to offer. So let me figure out a way in collaboration through negotiation, work out something that's good for the organization and good for me as well. So I think women have a good position there. And I was looking, because I'm also giving a talk in Colombia to a group of women in a workshop. I also want to update the statistics for the Colombian situation, which I captured a couple of articles. Now I just need to put it into my slides.
that, you're making me think about other conversations I've had of, maybe you'll see on like a church sign, say, all are welcome here. And there's kind of a conversation of like saying that all are welcome here is different than this space is specifically designed for you. Because maybe there's not people that look like you in that space already, or people are, wanting to be welcoming, but not really, or maybe in a more kind of like you're saying, tokenizing way, not in a really, let's really create a belonging in a community that is equally valuing all of our stories and our experiences and backgrounds. And I'm curious, in your consulting work, you kind of ask the question of, okay, how do we're good at the recruiting, but how do we, move beyond that to really incorporate all of these people and their stories and their experience into an organization? What do you have a kind of answer for that? What do you share with people that you consult with on that topic?
It's a hard thing to do because you're talking about systems in organizations. Mm-hmm. So a lot of times people have this attitude where, well, it's a system, so it's this thing, right? It's this thing that's created and it's a structure and I can't do anything about it. I'm just one person. What am I going to do? And so on. So they don't necessarily feel empowered to do something about it. So then I think, okay, yeah, but who makes the systems? People make the systems. So, if you think about self as instrument of change, the better you are, then wherever you go and whatever you do, you're already making a more positive difference in the situation. So then I said, okay, so let's not try to tackle the whole system because that can be quite overwhelming, but let's see what you can do on a day-to-day basis. And so a really good place to start is like people who are like mid-level managers. Mid-level managers, I think, are like very pivotal in an organization. So of course I like to work with leadership. I like to work with, frontline, grassroots, all of that. But the mid-level managers are where you can really make a difference. So what a lot of people don't realize is that when they move up the ranks, right, they move into managing others. And it's not something they specifically trained for or develop those skills. They develop some kind of technical skills. And then because they're good at that, they advance and they move into a managerial role. And too often organizations do not prepare people to be managers. So then they go in and then, all of a sudden they're struggling, right? They're struggling being a manager. Well, of course they're struggling because they don't know
right.
They learned how to be a manager. Now, yes, some people have a natural inclination to managing others and nurturing others, and that's great, but there's always something you can learn. So then they send them more remedial, to, well, you need management training or you need coaching, whatever it is. But once they realize in that position that they also have a responsibility to those moving up in the ranks who they supervise, then they can start to create opportunities for people to advance in their careers. So that means maybe, and this is something that you don't only need a manager to help you do, you can do yourself, but in the conversation of a performance review, it's a great time to not only talk about past performance and feedback, but where am I going next? So this is where I prepare people for their negotiation, for their performance review, to talk about, mentorship or learning and development opportunities, or what's the career path trajectory for me? How am I doing? Where's my gap? How can I fill in and enhance the skills that I need for my next level? What kind of projects can I be placed on to give me visibility and give me learning and opportunity? Because there are some like sectors that are sexier than others, or that you get more opportunities for. So managers can do that in the conversation. People who are being managed can do that. So that's how you start to make a difference. You create the path, and then you also create the opportunity for people to take up their power to move along that path. And I think this is why younger people in the workforce today are staying maybe 2 years in a situation. So when I was coming up in the ranks, 2 years is, oh my God, this person jumps around a lot. We can't rely on them. They're not loyal. They're not dependable, because on their CV, it has like 1.5 or 2 years. Today, it's like, oh, wow, they stayed there 2 years. It's a very different attitude. 2 years is like a big deal now, because people want to make sure that they're not being stunted in their development. They want to know that there's a place for them to go. And this includes all people, even people with diverse backgrounds who may not have been as hireable before are gaining more power in their choice. Not everybody, it's not a total revolution in the country, no, but there is more of that here, because when I was mentioning the pipeline earlier, it's also younger people, younger women under 30 are way more selective in what they're doing, which means that if they're not joining certain organizations because they don't see a place for them there, they don't see women in senior roles, they don't see opportunity for them, then that means the organization is going to suffer down the road because they don't have enough younger people in their pipeline, especially younger women. So that means that the younger women have more strength in their negotiations, and the organizations need to figure out, how do we need to adapt to bring in younger talent and keep them there? Because everybody may not become the CEO, but we need to bring more people into more senior levels. And we can only do that by bringing them earlier into the pipeline.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm thinking about that you referenced earlier that in your research, you found that it's a lot of women in news media are leaving. And so I'm curious about this difference between, do you stay in an organization, in a workplace, and work to make it better, or do you leave? And I'm curious about the role of negotiation in maybe people making that decision. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So it goes back to one of my big things, which people who know me know I'm always talking about self-awareness. So that's the first thing. So you need to strengthen yourself. And going back to self as instrument of change, you need to strengthen yourself so that you are more grounded, more centered, and more aware of what's really critically important to you. So, and self-awareness is something that you continue to do your whole life, because you mentioned that I had a complex life and all that, but we're all complex beings, right? So we all have different personas that make up who we are. And so this is something I've been working on lately too, is when you are in conversation with somebody, negotiation, conversation, interaction, a certain part of you comes forward more than other parts, right? Depending on who you are. So if I'm talking to my daughters, then me being a mother becomes stronger than if I'm talking to a colleague, because my role as a mother is going to come out. Unless we're talking about our children, then we shift perspectives, right? So you have to be aware of that. So that means that in preparing for a negotiation, which everybody needs to prepare, regardless of how much you think you know the other person and how much you think you know the topic, then you need to know, okay, what is this person going to trigger for me, and which part of me is going to become more dominant in that role, right? So that's what happens. So then you have to figure out, okay, who am I? And then who am I also means identifying the different stories that you carry with you in your different narratives you carry, and where those narratives came from. So you have your personal story about who you are, which is influenced by your social story, which means the social world around you, the social media, the media, anything in your community that comes around. How does that influence you? And which of those stories are you carrying consciously or unconsciously? Your family, what are the different stories that you grew up hearing in your family about what's possible for you, about who you are, which influence your personality, the kind of work you do, your profession. So that means whichever profession you're selecting, then you have influences from that profession about who you are. And, all of those different layers. And so it could be also that if you are a sports person, and then your identity is around sports. If you're an artist, your identity around art. So all of those stories play a role. And inside of all of those stories are some of the stories about negotiating. So that means you may have heard, you can do whatever you want. You're capable, or, well, you're not good enough. You're not old enough. You're not, you're too young. You're not experienced enough. A mixture of stories. So in the process of me working with people and they are identifying their stories, then I have to say, okay, now that you have this collection of stories, and there'll be more the next time you think about it, because every time you reflect on it, it's that snapshot of a moment in time when you're thinking about that. Which of those stories are generative? Which of those stories give you strength? Which of those stories build you up to be who you are? And which of those stories get in the way? Which of those stories block you? So the ones that aid you and are generative and strengthening, you want to grow those stories so they become the more dominant stories in your life. And the stories that get in your way, you want to, I love it if we can just delete, press delete, just delete them, or rewrite them, change them into what they're doing. So that's kind of the coaching, the training, the workshop I do. It's what I mention in my book a lot because the book is very practical. So that means people can pick it up and sort of turn to any section, especially section 3, where they have all the different CMM tools and other things in there, where people can work through what it is they want to work through for themselves to be the best they can be, so that they empower themselves when they go into their negotiation.
I'm imagining that maybe some people hear the words negotiation and think, well, I'm not an aspiring CEO at a Fortune 500 company. This is not really relevant to me. But I think like you're approaching it from a more holistic way. You're not just talking about negotiation in the workplace, right? Like we're negotiating all day, every day in our own lives. Could you talk about that side of negotiation in our personal lives too?
Sure. So when I was writing the book, which took a couple of different years to put it together, I first was going to focus it on the workplace, and it was going to be about careers and so on. And because a lot of my, organizational work is in the workplace. And then I started thinking, no, women are so much more than that, right? So we have all of these different things we're negotiating. So then there's a section on negotiating your personal life, your personal relationships, your romantic relationships, negotiating your family, different roles there, and negotiating just in the everyday business of going to the dry cleaners or something like that. And then I also, when I was writing the book, the Me Too movement was very strong. And I said, I cannot not pay attention to that. So I thought, how do I do this? Is such a delicate, sensitive topic. And I didn't want to just get into it too much. So I thought, okay, so I talked about negotiating compromising situations. That's how I framed it. And the reason is, it's very complex. And I'll just tell another story about that in a minute. But the complexity is that when you are, let's say, in the workplace, a lot of times the people who have power in the workplace, those are the people that may make you uncomfortable and that you may put you into compromising situations. And so if you go into those situations, then you could be compromising yourself in some way, which is not what you want. And if you don't engage with those people, then you could be losing out on different kind of career opportunities. So what do you do? So thinking about different strategies about how do you engage with these people? Do you have somebody else in the room? Do you make sure that the doors are like, what are you doing? Of course, at the end of the day, if you're uncomfortable, you are uncomfortable. And that talks about your emotional, psychological, physical safety. If any of those safety feelings are compromised, then of course you just exit immediately, right? So I was doing this book talk in May in Florida, and this young woman raised a question, and I felt that it wasn't an innocent question. I felt like there was something in her behind the question. And she said, when is a no a no? That's such a great question, because in the world of negotiation, without talking about compromising situations, a no is like, no, can't do that, and then you don't take no for an answer, you probe further.
Yeah, right.
Is okay, we need more resources. Nope, not in the budget, can't do that. So you don't just walk away, you want to go further. So I just stood there for a minute and I said, wow, that's like a really big question. And then I said, it depends on which no we're talking about. And then I talked about that in the world of negotiation, without compromising your safety, no is an invitation to probe further, ask more questions, get to the bottom of it, because sometimes people's initial reactions are put the hand up, no, but it doesn't mean that is a final no. It means it's an opportunity for conversation. However,
right.
If you're in a situation where your emotional, psychological, physical safety is being threatened, that is a very firm no. So you leave. Now, then I said, okay, so sometimes we're in situations where I may be, it's not blatant, but I may be in conversation or negotiation with somebody, and I may think, wow, I'm getting a feeling of discomfort here. What is that feeling? Why am I feeling so uneasy? He didn't say anything specifically, but I'm getting the creepy feeling like yuck, So then I said, okay, so you take a break. So, listen, I think I need a 10-minute break. Let's just break for now. You leave the room, you leave that environment. So you're physically going out, and then you think about it and think about, okay, what are the other possibilities? Like, why you get in touch with your own feelings, which is why the self-awareness part important. what is it this guy is doing that may be reminding me of somebody else, or what is it? So do I feel safe to continue or do I not? And so that's where you go back and say, listen, I think we need to end this conversation now. I'm not feeling comfortable, and maybe we can pick it up another time, but I'll let you know. And that would mean you invite other people in, or maybe you go back and you say, listen, I'm not sure I understood you correctly when you said whatever it was. Can you elaborate on that? And then maybe they go, oh, okay, it was my misunderstanding of what they meant there. So you have a choice, and that's the part that I think is empowering, is understanding that I don't need to be stuck in this situation. I take care of me first. And by taking care of me first, I decide if that is safe or not. And so that also is in the book. And it still is the judgment that you have to use your own judgment. But therefore, the more you know yourself, going back to the self-awareness, and the more you try to understand the other person and where he or she is coming from, then you make those decisions about, where am I going to go with this? Because if you totally cut yourself off, then you might, like I said, be missing those career opportunities. You want to think about, how can I still have access to the career opportunities without compromising myself, without making me unsafe? And then you get to think a little more creatively about how to create those situations of safety.
Yeah,
That's a lot I just said.
No, it was great. It was great. And I'm just hanging on to, I don't know exactly how I'm meaning to phrase this question, but just this kind of idea of like, if you're thinking about what a better social world is for you, a better social world in my mind, in like the working world, would be one where no male bosses make female employees uncomfortable or feel danger, and yet also acknowledging that is not the reality right now, that those are really real experiences that people have and face every day. And so I hear what you're saying of, here's how to deal with those situations. And then also, my heart is like, we shouldn't even have to be having these conversations. It's the people that are making other people uncomfortable that need to do the, self-awareness and changing. What do you think about that conversation?
Yes. And I remember recently I was having a conversation with somebody about equity. Oh, yes. Okay. We were talking about male allies, right? And male allyship. And and an ally is different than a mentor, different than a sponsor, different than a coach, right? So an ally is somebody who sort of sticks up for you and has your back and creates more of an equitable situation in the workplace. And we were talking about that, and some of the findings were that if it needs to be more explicit, and we're talking about explicit and implicit and all that, and I'm like, it's like so crazy that we even have to be having this conversation, because ideally, talk about better social worlds, we'd be working it out where we don't need to have allies, because there already is equity in the workplace. So yes, I think things shouldn't be handed to people. I think you need to work and earn and strive, and everybody has their own abilities and talents that they want to develop. And then I think that those opportunities need to be provided. And that's where the equity comes in, is that we're not all starting in the same place, but we need to have the opportunity to grow in whatever ways we can and want to. And it shouldn't be a person, or because of who we are, blocking that path. That if we choose to do something and we have the ability to do that, then those opportunities should be presented to us so that it's an equitable, equal opportunity. And that's the part where I think makes a better social world. Not everybody will take it up. Not everybody wants to take it up, but those that do should be able to. And that's the part that makes it more equitable. It's the same idea that when I do go to Columbia, I work with people who don't necessarily have access to some education. And so I'm happy to just teach different things to different people, because I know they're going to use it and they're going to use it well. And part of the amazing part of my work there is that in the 9 years I've been going there and working different youth leaders, and a lot of them I've been working with for 8 or 9 years, they all use CMM. It's all a part of what they do, which is so amazing. And just give a couple of stories there. So there was one time when I saw somebody over the course of 2 years, but I wasn't really up to date on what he was doing and all that. And then, so a few years ago, trying to remember if it was like just at the end of the pandemic, like we were starting to travel again, or just before, I can't remember. He said, Beth, I want to show you something. So I went to see something, and it just brought tears to my eyes, because what he had done in that 2-year space, when I didn't know all the projects he was working on, he was working for a foundation that worked with graffiti artists, and he was an organizer of graffiti artists. And so he was working with a community, and he was asking the community members, what does reconciliation mean to you? Because, Colombia had more than 60 years of civil war, lots of conflict. So working with a community and asking, what does reconciliation mean to you? And he was using different tools of CMM, different CMM models, for them to make explicit the different ideas they had about reconciliation. Then he called in a group of graffiti artists. And the graffiti artists, he said, okay, this is what reconciliation means to this community. And then they came up with some visual images, and they worked together to create this tremendous mural, which is outside the Museum of Memory in Medellin. So he took me to see the mural, and I just stood there with my mouth open. He was telling me the story, and I said, oh my God, you like blink, 2 years later, look at what happened. And he was using CMM, because CMM provided it's like the vehicle that allowed people to talk about things that might have been just uncomfortable or painful for them, but through the use of CMM, they could like separate themselves from it a little bit, make it a third object. And so they were able to do that. And then the graffiti artists did that. And so now we're doing another project in another place following that same methodology. We wanted to create a baseline to do a monitoring and evaluation to see the effectiveness of this particular organization providing resources to a group. And so we have this group of women in this community, and they're trying to create like a timeline. It's kind of like a serpentine model, creating their timeline over the years of when their background a little bit and they formed. And so one of the things we've been doing with the serpentine model is also creating these timelines where it's people's personal story, the timeline of the social story, and a timeline of the organizational story, and looking at those points of intersection. What was happening to you and socially when the organization formed? And so that's what we're working on now. And then we're bringing in graffiti artists to also depict different visual images for the mural that they are identifying through the timeline, through the CMM process. And that should be done, I think, by next summer, I'm hoping. So we're working on that. So it's amazing.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah, it's really heartwarming.
That's beautiful, and a great example of co-creation, which, is you're hand in hand with negotiation. And again, everything is a negotiation in our relationships because we're co-creating with others, and it's not something you could take for granted that everyone has the same definition of something like reconciliation. And so coming together and making that meaning together that's a really beautiful example of that.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. I know one of your lenses is, to talk about intercultural communication. And so I'm curious, in your conversation around gender and negotiation, what differences do you see in somewhere like Colombia, where you've spent a lot of time and done a lot of work, and the culture that you and I are most intimately familiar with in the United States?
It's something that is recently really caught my interest, and I don't know if I'm going to do a research project on this, but it's kind of like really needling me a little bit. Like I'm really curious about it, and that's the paradox of Colombian women, and I not to overgeneralize, but in my years of being there, and the women I've met, amazingly strong, beautiful women with great presence, and regardless of whether they are just like community leaders or mothers who maybe have lost their children and are to violence and are just getting out there and doing what they need to do to survive and have a really better sustenance, and nurturing other women, to women who are successful in media or in academia, whatever it is. So all of these beautiful, strong women, and then you have the, macho patriarchy of the culture, and they're also submissive. And I'm like, I'm trying to figure out, like, what is this dichotomy here? It's like they're strong in certain ways, and then submissive in other ways. And I guess we all are,
Yeah.
but it just seemed so in my face there, because I'm saying, because every time over the years, when I kept meeting like really strong women, I'm like, wow, and I was like surprised. And then I'm like, no, I'm not surprised, because wow, they're really dynamic, and the women I've met, once they have an idea or get hold of something, it's like, watch out, like they're not backing down. But then at the same time, it is a patriarchal society. And so they are forced to be submissive in certain ways, and I'm like, wow, and it doesn't mean that we're not that way in the US too. Because I remember years ago when I lived in Japan, people would say to me, oh, women in the US are so liberated. And I'm like, well, and I remember seeing this, I don't know if it was like 60 Minutes or something. There was a show on, and this is in the 1980s, I believe it was. There was a show on where it was talking about little girls becoming like, putting on makeup and going to like fashion shows and doing all this modeling and stuff. I'm like, oh my God, like putting those messages into little kids. And so somebody had said that to me. I'm like, well, no, we're all not, I mean, I come from New York. So yeah, on the coasts and in different places inside, but I mean, it's just a mixture of different people. So it's not that only Colombian women have that paradox. I think it's just an example that might be easier for me to study, but it's all over. And so I'm curious about that, is the strength and the submission, and how do you make sense of that? It's a sense making process. Yeah. How do you make sense of that for yourself, and how do you make sense of that in the culture and so on? And that's just so fascinating to me, and that's something I want to explore more.
I want to get into your book more to kind of do that. What I like about even just how you frame your book, in the very first sentence of the description of your book, saying we internalize so many stories. And I think that like internalized sexism or misogyny or patriarchy is a really powerful tool, and part of the answer to what you're asking around this dichotomy of you can be strong and you can be submissive. You can show up differently to different spaces as a woman. Because for me, consciously, I can say, oh, well, sexism is bad and everyone deserves equity and equality and to be able to live into their full humanity. And at the same time, I can have internalized sexism living in me that, like I was saying earlier, makes me feel like I'm in competition with other women, or block me from being able to celebrate other women's successes because it feels like a threat on my own or something like that. So I think the internalization is a big key, because like there's the stories of our lives, of our families, and then there's also the stories of our cultures and our systems that we do exist in, and we internalize them all the same, maybe.
Yeah, and I was sitting here thinking about that. I'm thinking about, well, there are good stories we internalize, not so good stories. And then I was thinking about the submissiveness. I think it's also about being vulnerable, right? And so there's, maybe because I'm from New York and the US, there's a sense of agency.
Yeah.
So if I choose to be vulnerable in a particular situation, then that's my choice, right? And then I feel comfortable enough and safe enough to be vulnerable. If I am pushed into a situation where I'm feeling vulnerable and not safe because I didn't choose, that's a different situation. I think you can be submissive. You don't have to be dominant all the time. You can be submissive, but you're choosing that. So that's part two. We internalize so much. And I think this is why I'm so big on self-awareness, is because we don't even know. We don't know what we don't know, right? So we don't even know what we've internalized. And so sometimes, people have reactions to things. And we're like, well, where did that come from? Like, why did I have that kind of visceral reaction to something that seems so innocuous? And then it's because we've internalized some of the story about it, right? So maybe, excuse me, not to get too psychological, but maybe we've had some kind of situation where it was a little bit traumatic for us and something else like triggers that trauma, or maybe we were, for example, one of the big things is, so we're taught, respect your elders. And a lot of cultures have a very strong ethos around that. You respect your elders, you don't answer back, and so on. So if you're in a negotiation and you're negotiating, regardless of the gender, you're negotiating with somebody who's older than you, you have that story in the back of your mind that may not be conscious, but it's like, respect your elders. And then you have these other stories where recently we just scream at women, you need to get out there and ask for what you want. You know, if you don't do it, nobody's going to do it. You got to be your own best advocate and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
We have these competing stories, right? So then we go in and we've consciously prepared for the negotiation. We're going to assert, we're going to ask, we're going to, you know, do all these things. And then we get in there, we're dealing with an older person. Then we're thinking, oh, wow. And suddenly you're feeling like really uncomfortable trying to assert yourself. And you're like, what's going on? I prepared so well. Why am I getting so nervous about it? Why do I feel it's not right for me to do it? Why do I feel that maybe I don't want to challenge them? And then you have this conversation going on in your head. It's like, wait a minute, challenging, you're supposed to assert yourself. No, but you're challenging authority. Like, what is going on? So you need to understand where those stories are. You've internalized, as a good girl does, right? The message that we should be girls, we should be likable and nice. We've internalized that story, and that gets in the way of us advocating for ourselves. So we have to come to some kind of understanding about what does that mean. So how do we assert and advocate for ourselves without being rude and without challenging in a negative way? So we are challenging the status quo because we want something more, but how do we do it in a way that's still nice? Now, we may not be able to get there. So we have to think about, okay, which is more important to me? Is it more important to me to just stay where I am as long as I'm respectful? Or is it more important to me to push the edge a little bit to get more about what I want and then risk being disliked or risk being thought of as abrasive, even if I'm trying not to be? But that's my framing. I don't know completely what the other person's reaction is going to be to me. This is all in my own head before I even get in there. And this is what we do. So internalizing all those stories, we need to make them explicit to understand what they are, where they're from, and why they're causing us to behave the way we do.
Yeah. One of the stories that is interesting to me is about, if you're thinking about equality, say, you know, between men and women or between all genders, the kind of unspoken story there is that we're saying, oh, well, women want to be equal to men, but that's saying that a man's way of being is the ideal way of being. Whereas there's a flip side of that to say, well, as a woman, there are things that I'm allowed to, it's socially acceptable for me to express my emotions in this way, or to communicate in this way, or to care about my relationships in this way. Don't you men, you know, or other genders, don't you want some of that too, where it's like not just women being equal to men, but everyone being equal to each other, in the sense that everybody gets to be their full humanity, have all the qualities, not just the ones that are, quote, feminine or masculine. And so it's interesting to me to think about, when you are empowering women in their negotiation skills, there's more nuance there than you just saying, we'll negotiate like a man.
Right.
Quote unquote, you know, because you're saying like the ways that you show up are already good enough. The culture, the story that you've been told is that it's not, but let's do that second step that we talked about earlier, not just recruitment, but, you know, the staying power of like, how do we create a new story, a new culture, a new society in a company, in a community that has the space for all these different ways of being and ways of showing up to negotiating. That's not, well, just be more like a man.
Yeah. Well, it's funny too that, so I was thinking, well, you know, it's not only about women's stories. I mean, men have stories too. And I'm not getting into that. Somebody else can because they have their own. So while you're in a negotiation, it's all about the relationship, right? So you're in relationship with this other person. So that is also a way of lowering the anxiety a little bit. It's like, oh my God, this is a negotiation. Well, no. It's like, hey, I'm curious about this person. I'm going to get to know this person better. So who am I in relationship to this person? So whatever you do or don't do, whatever you say or don't say, just by showing up, you're already triggering something in that other person, because that other person has his or her own stories that they're carrying, right? So if a man is in a negotiation with you and he grew up with the message that, you know, men control the world or men are more dominant, whatever that extreme kind of story could be, and you're coming in there and you're trying to assert yourself, or he perceives you are asserting, and then he might perceive that you are encroaching on his territory, and then may become defensive, may become uncomfortable, and then have his own way of reacting to that. So whatever you do, you're going into a situation and you're triggering something in that person. So that's something to be aware of too. Now, you can't necessarily help it, and you can't always predict it, but you need to be aware that that's happening. So then you have to figure out, as much as I advocate for self-awareness, I also advocate for other awareness. So I need to figure out who this person is that I'm negotiating with, and I do as much prep as I can in advance. And then whatever prep I do in advance, during the course of the negotiation, I am trying to figure out if what I prepared is accurate or not, and to continue to modify what I know. Because as I'm going through the process of the negotiation, I'm learning more about this other person. I'm learning more about myself in relationship with this other person, the context, where we are. The self-other context to me is very much CMM. I took that from CMM. All of those dynamics are playing around at the same time, because me having a conversation with any other person in a different context would be a different conversation, because the environment, the setting would just add something or take something away to the fluidity of our conversation that we're having. So I need to be aware of that. And it is interesting. And I'm saying, no, don't negotiate like a man, but you can learn from what men do. So I remember there's a woman named Deborah Kolb, who was one of the leaders of looking at women in negotiation. And she talked about how the typical sort of setup of a negotiation, like almost adversarial across a table, a very male way of looking at that. And she talks about, like a woman's seat at the table, right? So we're talking about the table, the negotiation table, and that you need a place at the table or to have voice at the table. So it's not about negotiating like a man, but learning from what they do. Because one of the historical things, and there's a book called Women Don't Ask, like women, and people have said to me when I've interviewed them, I didn't know I could ask for that.
Right.
And men, it's like, of course we ask for that. Like, why would you not ask for that? Like, that's just not even a question that they raise, because we're raised differently. We're nurtured differently, and we have different stories about who we are in the world just because of our gender.
You're taking me back to what you said about riding bicycles earlier. And, when one person learned to ride a bicycle, it got a little bit easier for everyone else to ride a bicycle. And that makes me think about, not that I'm saying anything new, but representation matters. And the way people talk about that, say, if you never see a woman in any leadership position, then how are you supposed to, in your own imagination as a child or whoever, believe that you could also be that? And so it makes sense to me that, the more women learn to ask for whatever, fill in the blank, the more women learn to say no and stand up for themselves, or, the list goes on and on of things that I'm hopeful that women can continue to be empowered to do in ways that men are already empowered to do. It's like, that makes me feel hopeful, I guess, kind of that framework that you offered earlier, to say the more that one woman can do this, the more women can follow, because it opens up that door. And it makes sense that, you could get a whole group of men say, oh, well, yeah, of course we ask for this. Of course we are assertive in this way. Of course we show up in this way. Of course we communicate in this way, because that's what their models have told them. That's their, version of riding the bike.
So another thing related to that is, a lot of times women will say to me, oh, it's so hard, I feel so uncomfortable doing that. It's really outside of my comfort zone. And I say, okay, so are you comfortable now with the way things are? And they'll say, well, no. I'm like, okay, and you're uncomfortable doing something different. So, all right, so you have two kinds of discomfort.
Right.
Which do you choose? Because both are uncomfortable. If you stay the way it is and don't do anything, then you're accepting. You're condoning. You're saying, okay, I accept this situation, and it's going to stay the same or get worse. It's not going to get better, probably. Or you can try that discomfort, and then at least you have an opportunity that maybe something will improve. And so then I also think about, for me in my own negotiations too, I'm thinking, okay, it's not only me negotiating for Beth, but it's me negotiating on behalf of every other woman in the world, because I'm thinking, if I give out and if I give in and if I don't try and I don't do it, I'm just making it more difficult for other women coming after me. I need to do something and set the bar where people can reach it better. So I need to demonstrate something in there. So now research has shown that women advocate for others better than they advocate for themselves. So that might
Yeah.
be helpful too.
Oh, yeah.
So if women say, okay, you know what? It's not only about me. I'm doing this on behalf of all my sisters around the world. Then maybe that would ease some of the discomfort that they have in thinking of themselves as pushy or going forward in discomfort, because they're paving the way for other women after them.
Yeah, that is interesting. And another podcast that I like to listen to is Glennon Doyle's We Can Do Hard Things. And she uses kind of similar language to say exactly what you're just saying. Staying in a situation that doesn't feel good for you is hard. Leaving is also hard. So just what's your quote unquote right kind of hard? What kind of hard do you want to be doing? And what you're saying is what kind of, uncomfortable are you going to, power through? It makes me think that I think a lot of women choose their own discomfort, like say like I'll choose a situation where I'm uncomfortable over a situation where I'm worried I'm going to make someone else uncomfortable by asking for too much, by being too loud, by being too much. And so it is interesting where it's like that is a big way that women are socialized to be the regulators of other people's emotions and experiences, and to, be selfless. And that's, such high praise for women to be so selfless, to always be thinking about others and their own comfort. But I like that reframing of like, you can still have that value of like, I'm being considerate of others' experience by standing up for myself. It's actually more considerate,
Right.
If you can frame it that way, for all the other women in the world, for my daughters, for my mother, for, everyone else, that I'm putting out the vibration of here's one more woman who's learning to stand up for herself.
Yeah.
I think that's really
It's
beautiful.
interesting too that, when I have two daughters, and so raising my daughters, people say, oh my God, how do you do it all? I say, well, not well, because you're working and you're this and you're that. And I think that, I don't know if all, but I would say a lot of mothers who work outside the home, because all mothers work in the home and outside the home. So if you choose to work outside the home, or you need to work outside the home, it's not a choice, and you have children, then there's part of you, like that 1 to 99% that's still in the home and feeling bad that you're not there. So, and I have to say that over the years, most of the time I was able to be there for the significant events, but there were some times when I couldn't. And that was just heart-wrenching, especially with my younger daughter. There was this video once of her at this event with her grandmother, and she was just like, it was a mother-daughter race, and she was just like schlepping her feet along with her grandmother. She was about 4 or 5 years old. And I just couldn't be there that day. And when I saw that video, it just broke my heart. Even today, I can still, and she's like in her 30s, I can still just get upset about that. But then after a while, and they said, Ma, you were a really good model, good role model. So at the end of the day, did I make all the best choices? Probably not. There are probably some better choices I could have made along the way, but you're still modeling something. And then when I look at young women wanting to learn from me or study from me because they've noticed me somewhere or admire something, it's like, oh, wow, so I don't do it for that. I do it because as a practitioner and an educator, I've been an educator in some form or another my whole life. Then I'm thinking, my adult life, then I'm thinking that what's the message, what's the message I want to impart? And it really is about the sense of agency and the sense of self-awareness and the sense of knowing what you need to know. And here's the way to do it. Because every time I learn something new, I'm always thinking, how can I use this? How can I integrate this? So if I learn some theory or research, whatever, or I see something, I hear something, how can I integrate this into what I'm doing? And so one of the more recent things I've done is looking at the neurosciences, because that's become a big thing.
Yeah.
I was trying to figure out, what is this? Because I remember my former career, before I got involved in all this, was in special education. And I work with kids with learning and behavioral disorders, which I'm not even sure what the PC terminology is today. But kids who had normal or above intelligence, but had difficulty learning. So in those days, in the 70s, we didn't have the kind of imaging that we have now. It's like 50 years later, we have all this wonderful imaging where we can look and see what parts of the brain activate when different things are happening. And the Hebbian theory about neurons that fire together, wire together. So we associate different things together. And then I read a book about emotions and how the social construction of emotions, and, CMM also has a foot in social construction, isn't that we created these worlds, we can create better worlds, right? We can disassemble it and reassemble it and all of that. So I started putting some of this together, thinking, okay, how can I use this? Like, how does this make sense? And it's good to understand that if we have any kind of trepidation about a negotiation, and even though we prepare and we still may not feel super prepared, going in there and just showing up, the part you're talking about before with that other podcast, showing up is already an accomplishment. So what if we rewire that association of the trepidation of negotiation with showing up and putting in the effort? So now when we hear negotiation, we see effort and positivity, and we just showed up. Even if you don't get the outcomes you want from the negotiation, the fact that you showed up is enough of a reward. So we have to continue to rewire. So you can't unwire, right? You have to rewire. So that means you have to have something alternative. So you consciously commend yourself, pat yourself on the back, whatever you need to do to celebrate the fact that you showed up, the fact that you didn't back down, the fact that you prepared and you were there. So just that alone. So then I started thinking about that. So that's another way of thinking about how to prepare ourselves for that. And so I think we need to celebrate ourselves all along the way and not be hard on ourselves, because life is hard. Life is tough every day. Just the fact that you can get out of bed in the morning and do what you have to do and face the world, that's a big accomplishment. You should commend yourself on that. But I think too often we don't do that. I mean, I don't do that either all the time either. I'm like, hey, today, great. No, I don't do that. But just to be in touch with, like, I got out of bed today and what am I happy about? What am I excited about today? Wow, I have a negotiation. Like, yes, I'm going to show up, or I'm going to negotiate, whatever it is. And I always encourage too, don't go out and do the most difficult negotiation around the most difficult issues with the most difficult person in your life. Don't do that to yourself. Start really small.
Yeah.
Even if it means just a little bit of a negotiation about what am I eating for lunch today? Where are we going to go for lunch? Or just little negotiations. Just practice that and sort of build your negotiation muscle. So the next time it becomes that much easier. And even though it won't always be easy, there'll always be some challenge, at least you're more prepared and you have the experience and the success of the experience to boost you for the next round.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm appreciative of all the stories that you've already shared. I think those are so helpful to understand this whole conversation we're having. And I'm just curious to, go back to dig a little deeper. If you have any personal experiences that you'd be willing to share that you have off the top of your head that maybe has been part of your self-awareness journey, to say where you are now, like what are the moments in your life that make you so excited to empower other women and that give you this lens of gender to have such a powerful role in your life and your work?
So when I lived in Japan, one of the reasons I went there originally was to study art and study calligraphy and live with a family and teach English. And there's a whole story behind how I got there, but I got to Japan and I was young. It was just about a year after I graduated university, probably. So I had been a year traveling through Europe, and then I came back, and then I went to Japan. So I was studying brush painting, which is sumi-e, with an older man, like a grandfatherly figure. And I was studying calligraphy with a little woman, like a grandmother. So I had the grandfather and the grandmother. And at that time, I was macrobiotic, so I didn't eat sugars, and I was very strict macrobiotic, vegan. And I also have an art background, so I came out of the US culture of be yourself, be creative, be individual, right? Very, very strong messaging that I took up very strongly because I come from New York, and I want to be myself and be an individual. So then I go to Japan and I'm studying with the man, and he is saying, this is how you hold the brush, and this is how you put the ink on the brush. And then he's giving me very strict compositions. He said, this is where the rock goes, and this is where the tree goes. And I was like, oh my God, and he would sit there and he would demonstrate, and then I would go home and practice, then I'd bring it back and he would correct it. So I would do like black ink and he would take this orange ink and just correct it. And then at the end of our session, his wife would come upstairs and she would tell me, she knew I didn't eat sweets. So she would tell me in Japanese, this is not sweet. Meanwhile, it's like strawberry shortcake, chocolate. I mean, it was all these very sweet things. And I remember thinking, what part of that is not sweet? And I didn't really speak Japanese. So I was like, hand gestures and all that, and the obligation of, should I eat it? Is it rude not to eat it? The whole thing, and just getting really annoyed. This went on for like 6 months. I would go there weekly, and for 6 months, I was just getting angrier and angrier. I was just so annoyed. And I was belittling them, like, who do they think they are? And I've been studying art for all these years. How is he telling me how to hold a brush? And why is she telling me this is not sweet? It's strawberry shortcake. Of course it's sweet. You know, thing. And then one day I remember I just started crying by myself. I just was so frustrated. And I said, what is wrong with you? And I just had this epiphany of like, what is wrong with you? They didn't ask for you to come to them. You chose to go to them, and you chose to study art and calligraphy. You chose that. So why don't you just stop being such an idiot and just go in there and just relax a little bit? So I had to work on myself to really just go with the flow. I'm there to learn from them. What they're teaching me is not a threat to who I am or what I know. It's just enhancing all that. So I studied with them for 6 years, and I just adored them. Wow. I did make advancements in my work, and not my calligraphy as much, but in my painting I did. And it was just amazing, and I got to, like, if I ate the sweet or I didn't eat the sweet, I wasn't going to die from it. It was being acrobatic. So I just learned a lot. And then I also so that was me about learning and about cultural differences and how to understand and how to open up to different kind of possibilities. And that when you intake other things, it's not a threat to your core, because you are who you are, but it enhances and modifies in different ways. And being an American woman in Japan, I had different kinds of opportunities than Japanese women did because I was foreign. So they put me in this other kind of category. Whereas in an organizational context, Japanese women in those days, and probably still to this day to some degree, when they first come into an organization, are called OLs, office ladies. And basically, it doesn't matter what their educational background is. They make tea, they serve tea and coffee. And
wow.
A lot of times in those days, and maybe today to some degree, they were viewed as coming into the organization to meet a man, to get married, and then go have babies and have a family.
Yeah.
So they weren't given the same career opportunities because they weren't serious, right? Whereas I was, and I didn't work in a traditional Japanese firm, I worked in a foreign firm in Japan. So I worked at an international school. I worked for McKinsey and Company. So I worked in places where being an American woman was more acceptable than not. So I wasn't in a traditional, like a Mitsubishi or something like that. So that helped, even though I worked with some traditional Japanese people in the organization, I was not expected to be a traditional Japanese person. I was a foreigner. So that also made me more aware too of women. And that's another dichotomy there too, because Japanese women, as sort of submissive as they may need to be in the workplace, they're the ones who control the purse strings at home. So, the guy comes home with his monthly salary and she's in charge of it. And then she doles out an allowance back to him. So that's interesting too. It's like, yes. And they're also fierce. So the appearance of a culture being very patriarchal or not, like in the US, like I said, people think, well, we're all liberated. Well, we're not. But the myth is that we are. And then you go to these other cultures where they're supposed to be more like macho patriarchy, but they're also very liberated. So it's really a lot more nuanced than we think.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thanks for sharing that story. That is interesting. And that gets me back to the meaning making of like, what we consider to be liberated or not is different, or what we, consider to be norms for gender is different across cultures too, which I think that's why I think it can do so much for us. It can be so rich too. Like, it seems like you've had a lot of experience with, is getting to immerse yourself in other cultures and knowing the people that are a part of them and learning about that and understanding that to be able to expand your understanding of meaning making.
Sure. Yeah. Because it gets so nuanced. And then you even start to question, like, well, why do I have the beliefs that I have? Like, where did that come from?
Yeah. I want to get a little bit more into your book, New Story, New Power. What is the new story? that you're hoping to tell women in this book?
Yeah, good question. So the new story is really that we are a lot more capable than we think we are. We can work with who we are and work with our stories if we become aware of what they are and use them to our own advantage and the advantage of others. Because you think about being in a relationship, I like to think about it as a collaborative process. So if you think about relationship building in a negotiation, sometimes we think, well, I'm only going to have this one conversation with this person. I'll never see him or her again. You never know. You never know who pops up back in your life again. Or if you have an issue with this person, chances are that you need to work out that issue, because that issue will appear in other people, in your lessons to learn through life, right? So that's the new story. The new story is understanding self and understanding what I bring, what I'm capable of. And that's a new sense of power, because there's a sense of agency and developing your skills and your awareness. That's the new power. And I have to say, it wasn't my title. I cleverly wrote a title that didn't even have the word negotiation in it at the beginning. I had story in there, but no negotiation. And then my editor and the publisher and the production manager, they all got together and were brainstorming different ideas. And then they gave me a couple to choose from. I said, oh, wow, this is good. And then the more I've talked about this title, the more like I love the title, because I think it's just a good title and people like the title too. So I give them all the credit. It was their idea. And I love that they did it and didn't take what I put down. I don't remember what I put down, but it was nothing that would have been useful as a negotiation book.
Yeah, I always appreciate using that frame of stories. And so I think that's a really valuable tool to hand women to, is to, let's talk about your negotiation and let's do it through a frame of what are the stories you're telling? What stories do you want to be telling? And yeah.
I think it's also a way of empowering. So as I mentioned earlier, when you identify the stories that govern your life, you figure out which are the ones that work and which are the ones that don't. Even that weeding out those stories, that's also a sense of empowerment. You're choosing, like, I'm going to keep this story and I'm going to change the other story because it doesn't work for me. It doesn't work anymore. So like an analogy I like to give is when I talk to students or people I'm coaching in a workshop, I'll say, all of you have succeeded so much in your life so far. You got to where you are. You're either in this program, you're in the workshop, you're in the organization, you've succeeded very well. So you should really commend yourself on being the mature professionals that you are. And then just picture going home for family holiday dinner. And usually people just start laughing. They go, oh my God, because you're out in the world and you're advancing yourself and you're changing your stories, but your family, they have all those old stories that have not grown with you. So you go home and then let's just say you drop a piece of food in your lap and they go, oh yeah, you always were very sloppy. You always did get dirty, or, that kind of thing. They're like, oh my God, I'm that 8-year-old or that 12-year-old all over again. I thought I've advanced it. Or you say to yourself, I am not going to be triggered by Uncle so-and-so because I know he's going to say something.
Yeah.
It's going to trigger me. And then you say, I'm not going to fall into it. I'm not. And then he says something and you just can't stand it. Or you're talking about politics and you just go there. So those are the things that we have to still have control over. That's really hard because those stories are so old and so deeply embedded. It's hard. And it's very hard for people to change and mature their stories about you, because that means they have to change their stories about them because you're in relationship. So if you're not that, then they're not the same either. So now who are they? So that's why I like the idea of like systems therapy and not just individual therapy, because you have to change maybe individually too, but with your family system to support the change you want to make.
Yeah, I think that's an important point of that. Yeah, again, we said that the meaning originally was co-created, and so you can't hope to go back and create the new meaning in isolation. That's also going to be a collaborative process for sure.
That's right. That's right.
I know you'll recognize the CMM-ish language here, but this is how I want to try to keep ending my conversations, and that even that language in and of itself is a little confusing because I don't want the conversation to end. I want to think about what are the next turns, maybe for people who have listened to this conversation with us, people who have read your book, people who are maybe in that building self-awareness stage. What do you hope for people after listening to this conversation to keep this idea alive in their own lives?
I think life is exciting and every day is an opportunity to be better than the day before, you to be better, the world to be better. So, set little milestones, little markers along the way to work towards as a way of motivating yourself, if that's what works for you, and to congratulate yourself. And that it's really, even when things are challenging, it's a way to take a step back and say, that's interesting. I wonder why that happened, or I wonder why he said that. I wonder whatever it is, even in the most challenging situations, or if things are like what is going on in the universe today, that like you just take a step back and just take a breath and go on, so that there are practical ways of moving forward. And if this can be overwhelming, then just take one little step at a time, one little movement at a time, and then just continue to build that. And I am going to say also a plug here that what I've been offering to people is, if you read my book, and maybe not every page, but if you read my book enough to know what it is, and you write a positive review for the book on Amazon and let me know, I will offer you a 1-hour free coaching session. So that's something that is out there in the public.
Right.
Yeah. I think it will expire
Great.
at the end of this calendar year, but that's kind of what's out there right now.
That's great. Yeah, I just want people to keep, having the tools to keep this going, not just, listen to this conversation and then turn off the podcast and forget about it, but to, start doing some of that reframing and self-awareness work. And so those are some good next turns.
And the process of making things explicit that you take for granted, that's just such a part of you, is just part of your with who you are. And through CMM, you can surface different aspects of who you are.
Yeah. Well, Beth, what else do you want to say about your book or your work or your own stories before we wrap up today?
It's been an adventure. It's not done. I'm still curious and still moving on and still building on it. And every time I am in conversation with somebody about it, about the topic, then I always take away something too. And it's a way of me also refining my own thoughts in process. I used to be a lot more extroverted than I am, but I still have a little bit of extroversion where I like to think through things in conversation, and that we really all have a lot of agency, even within constraints. And constraints are not necessarily a bad thing, but there's also a way of putting a boundary around where the space that we can be creative inside of. So that if people are not familiar with CMM, I encourage you to keep experimenting with it. If you are familiar, for me, and it's been since the 1990s, I'm still learning new ways of using it, new ways of engaging with the information and the material. And I learn by sharing it with other people and then seeing what comes back from their use and understanding of it. And I remember that Barnett was very generous in spirit. I would say, well, is it this or is that? And he would say, yes. So it was always very generative and generous.
Yeah.
And so trying to keep that spirit alive as well. It's been really helpful.
Yeah.
So
that's wonderful.
For the conversation today. I've enjoyed it immensely.
Thank you, Beth. I really appreciate you sharing your time and your stories with me. Okay, that is all for our conversation with Beth. At the end of each episode, I do like to offer some questions to reflect on. This acts as a next turn for us, so the conversation doesn't stop when the episode does. Today, the questions I would have you think about, and I do have quite a few, so stick with me, are: what do you negotiate in your life? What is your relationship to belonging? What is your relationship to identity? How do these things affect the way you show up in the world? What is something new you can try to better advocate for yourself or better negotiate with others? How can we rewire our ways of thinking and being to better celebrate the ways that we show up? And finally, what does it look like to empower ourselves in our storytelling? That's a lot of questions, a lot of reflecting that I am asking you to do, I know. So maybe just pick one or two of those that speak to you and spend some time with that this week as you reflect on this conversation. In addition to doing some reflecting by yourself, I invite you to share these reflections with me, as well as any of your own questions or ideas. You can do that through email, through my website, or by commenting on Instagram and YouTube. Links to all of those places are in the show notes. The reason that I invite you to share your reflections with me is to stay in dialogue. And another great way to keep dialogue going is to follow the show wherever you listen. That way you won't ever miss an episode. Another great way is to leave a rating and review, which helps this podcast to get in front of as many people as possible. But most importantly to me, the best way to keep the dialogue going is to share this episode. You can do that personally by texting the link to a friend, or you can share more broadly on social media, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, any of the places that you are on. My hope for this podcast is that I am able to invite you into this space, invite you to have these conversations with me. And so it's very meaningful for me if you in turn want to invite others in as well. If you do post anywhere, or if you did want to connect with me on social media, you can find me on Instagram as Stories Lived, Stories Told Pod. You can also tag me on LinkedIn and Facebook at the CMM Institute for Personal and Social Evolution. Speaking of which, I am supported by the CMM Institute for Personal and Social Evolution. This podcast is just one of many initiatives designed to create space for more conversations that move us toward those better social worlds we hope to create. You can learn more about the CMM Institute and their other initiatives at the link in the show notes. Thank you for showing up. Thank you for being curious, and thank you for being a part of this story. I'm Abbie, and this has been Stories Lived, Stories Told.